without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker this morning, Meir Levi. He has over 20 years of business process management and operational excellence leadership and has worked with world-leading organizations from diversified sectors. I am really excited to hear what he has to say today, so help me welcome Meir Levi.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Welcome to the promised land of BPM. I want to thank you for being here this morning, and like Eric said, I have 20 years behind me in BPM. This is just about when the concept of business process was born. I've seen a lot during the 20 years, and I hope to share some of my experience with you this morning. I'd like this session to be engaging, so if you have any questions, feel free to stop me, ask me. Practically what I want you to get out of this session is that while some of you have seen BPM become a complex kind of undertaking, there is a simple way to leverage the benefits of BPM. So without further ado, let me see if that works. Yeah. This is the presumed agenda for my presentation, but I'll probably deviate a bit from it. I don't know how many of you need education on BPM. This is not going to be an education session. I'm not going to do BPM 101. I'm just going to repeat a couple of concepts. But primarily, what I'd like to describe where BPM is today, briefly, how the technology has been evolved, and how can you select the kind of focus that will bring benefit to your organization. This is a survey that was done by the Gartner Group about organizations that either have taken initiative to deploy BPM in the last 12 months or are planning to do that in the next 12 months. Now, this was done in mid-2011. If I ask here in the room, how many of you belong to this type of organization? How many of you have undertaken a BPM initiative in the last 12 months or are planning to in the next year? Okay, only a handful of hands. So perhaps the reason you are still not doing it is because either it's somehow a mysticism concept to you, or it's become too complex. So hopefully I'll be able to add value to you today. If you look at the top three processes, these are process areas of the organization that did undertake to take BPM. They started in the customer-facing processes, and sorry for the small fonts, but I'll read it to you. The task management processes and integrating data across different applications. What does that tell you? That they leverage BPM to either generate value for your customers, either to manage operational processes, task management, and they found big value in integrating IT within the organization. And the next three to follow relates to document-centric workflow, compliance, and compliance is big on my agenda, and processes across the virtual enterprise, across the supply chain to external partners. So let's talk a bit about BPM. First of all, BPM is an acronym that over the years got many interpretations: business process modeling, business process monitoring, and lately business process management. We're also aware of BPI, BPA, and BAM, business activity monitoring. So don't get lost in the acronym. Just remember that BPM as a technology platform is not a tool. It is really a transformation approach to the enterprise. If we look at history, where BPM came from, some of you here, especially in the Omaha area, remember the whole TQM wave in the 80s, where total quality management ruled the nest, and basically every enterprise would have gone to quality management projects. And that slowly disappeared. Michael Hammer was a professor, a Harvard University professor that got to be very well known and was in the top 25 leaders in IT and business during the mid-90s. Michael Hammer came out first with the business process re-engineering, BPR, with his article at the Harvard Business Review, Do Not Automate, Obliterate. How many of you remember the BPR era? So basically, Michael Hammer said, yeah, business processes are very important, and they are the key to transformation of enterprise. I don't believe in incremental improvements. You want to do a good job, you got to revamp your whole enterprises. One of the stories that stands in my mind is related to two car makers in Detroit, and I won't name names. One of them had 400 people in their accounts payable department, the other one had 7. And basically, the one that had 7 said, I don't need to invoice every supplier. I'm going to classify my suppliers, and 97% of them will be at Class A, meaning that I can trust them, I can trust their shipment. The moment that the shipment gets to my dock, within 10 days, I pay you based on the shipping slip. So no invoices. That's how they revamped totally the invoicing process, and they got their staff from 400 to 7. Not only they got their staff from 400 to 7, because they paid so fast, they negotiated 3% discount on the payment, while the other one was struggling in the traditional manner. Now, so that's an example of totally revamping a process. However, BPR got some bad rap because many organizations like American Express invested millions in trying to do that, and without great success. So BPR went from climbing in the mid-90s to being on top of the agenda to slowly disappearing as well. And BPM appeared in the early 2000s. What happened in between? Y2K took place on the agenda. Everybody thought that their world will collapse when year 2000 will hit the mark, but that didn't happen. So then business process management start evolving. And what we have seen during the 2000 decade, we have seen a lot of standardization evolving. One of the biggest results is the BPMN notation. Today, any enterprise who describe their processes use the same notation, so it's very easy to understand the processes. And BPMN stands for the Business Process Modeling Notation. We see other standards for automation, BPEL, Business Process Execution Language, XPDL, etc. So the decade of 2000 really shaped up to what BPM is today. The last thing is, last two items here, BPMS is the Business Process Management Suite. So BPM evolved to, as you'll see in a moment, multiple components, and the suite means that you don't just model, analyze, and monitor your processes, but you also move to execute them. So you have an execution engine in. The latest that has been coming out from the industry analysts such as Gartner is the iBPM, which is the intelligent BPM. And basically connecting to the process platform different level of analytics, whether these are real-time from execution, transactional processes, or whether these are KPI and metrics that govern some of the operational execution of the organization. So, if you didn't get confused yet, I'd like to simplify things. And it was Albert Einstein that says, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So the basic unit of a process, and that's how we start. You know that in a given enterprise, you could find thousands of processes. Maybe not thousands, depending on the size of the enterprise. But I mean, in our experience, we started with enterprise that had anywhere between 150 to 1,000 processes. But processes are best described in hierarchies, and I will show you some of the framework when we talk about deployment. At the basic building block of a process, you see a sequence of activities that start with a triggering event and ends with a value delivered to a customer. And around the process, you'll find different type of critical objects that play a role in the execution of the process. So what's important when we look at the business architecture that surrounds the business process, it's important to understand that the process actually serves as the skeleton of the business architecture, on which you can hang the roles and resources that execute the process. You can hang things like risk objects and controls to mitigate the risk in a process. Metrics, how does this process being measured? We look at inputs and outputs, what comes into the process, what goes out, etc., etc. I will not go through all of it here, but I want you to take one very important point from here, which is that having a good business architecture around the process is critical, because the process doesn't stand on its own. And what's more critical is if you have a repository of your processes that can house the business architecture in a, I'll use the word simple, and don't beat me on it, in a way that is simple for non-technical user to see the forest from the trees. So when I look at the process, I can understand it because I know what's coming in, what goes out, who executes it, what's my risk, etc., etc. When we move to the type of technologies that support the creation of business process repository and all of the other benefits that BPM can bring to the enterprise, we see a lot of components. And what you see here is a picture that was done by Gartner in November 2011. The type of technologies that surrounds the process execution engine. So you can see a rule engine, you can see a process simulation, modeling engine, document management, etc., etc. Now, if you try to bring that into your organization, you're probably going to end up with a 100, 200-page RFI. And I don't think you want to do that. If you're new to BPM, what I'm going to talk about, where I feel is critical that you start, and from there you can expand. If we look at the trends of the technology over time, and how many of you are familiar with the hype cycle? So this is the hype cycle, again, a la Gartner. And hype basically tells you, remember how I talked about BPR before, that went up and then went down, TQM went up, down. So what we want to do is we want to look at where BPM is in the hype cycle. And there are many different aspects to the BPM technology that have gone on the timeline. Some of them already passed the hype and got to the next stage where they either disappeared or became sustainable. What we have chosen from all of the approaches here are 4 components. One is the process repository. The second is BPA for the masses. The third is the BPM suites. And the last is the process analytics. If you just keep in mind those 4, you are starting the road to simplify BPM. So the repository is what I talked about earlier. It's the foundation on which you can build everything else. BPA for the masses is critical because we have seen a lot of BPM projects that failed just because the community of the business user was not engaged. So whatever undertaking you consider, you have to make sure that you keep in mind the engagement aspects of all your stakeholders, all your users, all the way up to the C-level layer in the organization. BPM suites, one of the critical ROI is the ability to take certain processes and automate them. We have seen organizations that started with the automation and it became just like any other application in the company. You really want to create a big picture before you start your automation. The big picture will enable you to prioritize which are the most important areas for automation. And finally, the analytics. Understanding what you have done and being able to monitor and see how your process is performing. So when you look at BPM technologies, you need to, these are the key elements that you have to make sure that exist within any BPM technology. The ease of use, the existence of business architecture as part of the tool, integrated governance. I haven't talked much about governance. One of my case stories is about that, but I know that the initiative to create a compliant environment and meet some of the regulatory requirements, the internal and external audits, sometimes are handled independent of the organizational infrastructure. However, think about that. If you were able to create the process library with all the stakeholders, with all the responsibilities, you are halfway to creating a great compliant environment within your organization. When you create this type of environment, the best way to communicate to the business users sometimes is by generating process book, standard operating procedures. And if your processes are mapped and go through a life cycle, you'll be able to do that automatically, and the new version of the process will be there when you create the next process book. Collaborative life cycle is critical because Once you created the library, you want the business stakeholders to maintain it. You don't want to bring a consultant every now and then to do that. It becomes part of the job of the stakeholder to go into the repository and to make the changes, make the reviews, etc. And that's why it has to be simple. Comprehensive BPMS, you should be able to easily take a process from the library and go through the automation process. And finally, cost of ownership. By having all of the above, you're going to reduce your cost of ownership because it's going to become part of the organizational culture. And some of the benefits that you can bring to your organization are listed here. Being agile, improve the responsiveness of the organization is critical. Improve strategic alignment, reduce audit compliance costs are some of them. Create the necessary transparency within the organization. And many more. So how do we move to deploy something like that in a proven and easy way? There are 4 things that you need to consider if you are to bring BPM into your organization. The first one is to set your objectives and make your business case with a clear ROI. And there are multiple drivers that will trigger bringing BPM into an organization. I'll talk about that briefly. Either you're changing your technology within the organization and you need to clarify your processes. That's typically one of the most common drivers. Others, just the need to become more agile. We are sluggish. We can't make changes within the organization. A third one is M&A. We just merged with another organization. We have redundant processes. We need to make sure that we become more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. So when you make the business case, you're going to get the buy-in, and the buy-in from the top is critical because remember, this is a transformation. It's not a one-time project. Plan the project, and very often when organizations start with such an undertaking, they start with a proof of concept, with a pilot. Make sure your pilot is in a visible area that most people in the organization can identify with. It's attainable. The scope is not huge, so you can complete it in a relatively short period of time. And that it's going to be your selling tool to the rest of the organization. And create the life cycle. So creation of the life cycle is critical because, like I said before, you want to make sure that the business stakeholders are the one that maintaining at the end of the day. To build the ROI, you can find different metrics and different measures. One of our clients actually computed the number of days it takes an employee to become productive before and after they brought the whole BPM into the organization. And they demonstrated the savings that within 6 months gave them the return on investment on the BPM project. So that's just one example, and I'm not going to dwell too long. I'm sure that you can find different areas where you can compute return on investment. You need to understand where your organization is situated today vis-a-vis the maturity cycle. So the different industry analysts have come up with different types of maturity cycles. This is one of the simpler ones that also demonstrate where most organizations are today. So level 1, you might have some ad hoc processes documented. Level 2, you start moving to more organized processes, level 2 and 3. In level 4, the processes are actually managed, and in level 5, continuously improved. So the question is, how do we move from the lower level to the upper level? And what I'm going to introduce is 2 deployment methodologies that actually will simplify the climbing through the maturity scale. So the use of best practice framework, such as the APQC, enable you to bring the process framework that has been developed and proven by many industries and start from there. Even though you might have a number of processes already mapped out in-house, you can bring them under a proven framework. There are multiple frameworks that exist within the industry, but the APQC is one of the most acceptable one. And APQC also developed framework for different industries. So it actually jumped from, let me see if I can bring this one back because I want to talk. So what you see here, you see 12 top processes that can be quite typical in every given organization. So you look at all your process library from the top, and you can change it to adapt to your organization. The framework will give you level 2 and level 3 breakdown, and then you can actually decide where you want your initiative to commence and start. So if we take So let's look into one of the processes, which is the HR process, and every organization have HR process. And here you can see 6 sub-processes. And there are multiple metrics that are attached to these processes. If we further break down the employee recruiting process, we can see the next level. We can see different types of sub-processes that exist in recruiting. And your organization might have a different way of recruiting people, and you can adapt it here. What's more important here to understand that while the framework and the library is very clear to visualize when it's structured in such hierarchy, most people like to look at a process in a kind of swim lane view. Before we move to the swim lane view, this is the SIPOC methodology, which I will focus on in one of the deployment formulas that I'm going to give you. But so here is a view of a swim lane, and this is taking the process from hierarchical view to how it crosses between different organizational units or different responsibilities within the organization. So for instance, interview candidate process have an input that comes in, which is a candidate coming in, and it has an output which is a short list of candidates. And these are the boundaries of the process. You define who supply the inputs, and who are the customers of the process. And the SIPOC methodology is important to get your business user engaged, because anybody who is dealing with any process unit knows what they have to deliver to the next customer of the process. So here is an example of a swim lane of that process. How does the process flow from the HR agent to the HR manager to the secretary? So that's just a simple depiction of a process. Another framework is the ITIL framework. Many of you come from the IT side of the organization will be familiar with ITIL. And again, it makes life a lot easier when you start with a framework that has been proven as a best practice. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with it, that it's the best for your organization. You can change it, but this is a great starting point. Another one is the SCORE, the supply chain framework. And I had another one here, which is for the mobile and telephony. But there are multiple frameworks that exist for, depending what industry you come from, you can find the framework that is suitable for you. Two deployment methodologies. One is for the creation of the process library. So what's the best way to get your users and stakeholders engaged in, first of all, buying into the process framework of the organization, is by engaging them in workshops where they are constructing the process for themselves. And we believe that workshops like that should not take more than 1 hour. Normally, users and managers don't have time. They have their jobs to do. You get them in a room for 1 hour, you present to them the SIPOC of their process, and through this 10-step methodology, you get them to step through creating the as-is and the to-be. And after the workshop is done, there is one more step where they get the process, they validate it. Sometimes they will map it themselves. And now you got a user that when they see the process, they're, oh yeah, I did that one. So I'm not going to go through all the steps here, but we have been using this methodology for the last probably 8-9 years quite successfully with our users and clients. The next one is a methodology to take a process and automate it. And automation is a little bit different undertaking than capturing and discovering a process. We call it the 4D process deployment methodology, where first you actually, with the business stakeholder, you map out the requirements, because even though you have a process map, sometimes when you go to automate it, different stakeholders may want different results from the automation. You can get a lot of things once you start to automate a process. And here I have to just point one thing, that one of the risks of BPM is when you start mapping a process for automation at a business user level. The business user will get lost. So you got to separate between the two. So when you go to automation, you go through the discovery, then you design the process, then you develop it, then you deploy it. And under each one of those, there are different levels that you need to go through. But we have been using this, taking processes from the library and taking them all the way to automation. And we have a number of actually good examples of this being successful. So what's the big risk in getting BPM to your organization? The biggest one, in my view, is the resistance for change. And there are many reasons why at different levels, you get resistance for change. Anywhere from someone fearing for their territory, they're going to lose their power. Someone is just afraid. How will I exist in the new world? And you'll find behaviors within organizations that sometimes what we call passive-aggressive. People will say, oh yeah, we are all for it. And then they'll put sticks in the wheel and suddenly the project will be unsuccessful. So it's really, process management is much more about change management. And it's highly psychological. And here I have I won't stay too long on this slide. This I got also from Dr. Michael Hammer. I participated in one of his seminars. By the way, unfortunately, he passed away about 4 years ago. He was a great guy. But his BPM, his business process seminar, there was 4 days. The last day was all about change management. And to sum it up, we sum it up with the 7I. The way to battle change management, first of all, is to provide the right information to people and the right incentives. What's in it for me? Why should I go through this change? How will that improve my life at the end of the day? And you go all the way to where at some point you do have to say, this is the way we do it. And if you're not on board, you're out. The biggest potential resistant to change would be a soldier in the battlefield. A soldier in the battlefield, it's against all concepts that I'll go and sacrifice my life. Yet, I'm very motivated to do my job. Why? First of all, I got the right training. I'm very confident I can do it. So if you don't give the right training to your people, they'll be scared. They'll have fears. I have the right incentive. My incentive may not be money. It may be the good of my country. So you can learn a lot from a soldier in the battlefield and transcend it to your business. Go ahead.
What tools and techniques do you use on that side?
This is concepts that have been developed by Michael Hammer. Very good question. There is one tool which is the adaptable change management tool. And that's a good one to adopt within your organization. Another one is Posky. I don't know if anyone heard of it, but if you want some more information, I can talk to you after. Here's an example of when we automate a process. And remember, business users may fear the automation. It's unknown to them. But practically, you take what they do on a day-to-day basis, and you bring it to a very friendly kind of electronic form that all they have to do is they get it by email or they get it through the automation engine, and they have to go in and fill up the information, but electronically. And then they push a button, it goes to the next stage. So it's very critical that whatever you create it with the business user in mind. So I'd like to talk about a couple of business cases. Let me see how this. I'll talk about a large organization and a smaller one. The smaller one is also a large organization, but it's a unit within the smaller one. The British Network Rail. Some of you have been in Europe, in England, and have traveled through the railroads of England. The British Network Rail is an organization that manages all the infrastructure and the assets of the railroads, the bridges, the stations within the Great Britain. And practically they have 35,000 employees. So how do you bring BPM to this organization? Now, what you need to remember is that they already have, at some places, BPM initiatives. They had Oracle in-house. They tried to automate certain areas, but there was no visibility across the organization. So last year they came up with a concept called process library. We want to establish a process library that will be a one-stop shop that anybody who wants to understand this process or that can go into the process library and see it. And this is maintained by the process stakeholders and exposed to the rest of the organization. So this was the project. And the charter was that it must be easily accessible and understood by everybody. Some of the benefits that they wanted to get, first of all, aside of the knowledge sharing throughout the organization, which is a very novel idea, to standardize their processes, to eliminate duplicates, and to clarify all the responsibilities. So we started the project. It's a very new one. We started it in Q4 of 2011, where we migrated 100 processes of the chosen area for the proof of concept. Those processes have been done by individuals using Visio. And the area was what they call the investment unit. It's the unit that invests in building new assets, such as new rail stations, new railroads, new bridges, or also replacing some of the old ones. And by Q1, we were able to, or they were able to expose the initial library to a selected group of users for feedback. And the feedback demonstrated, they're still collecting a lot of the feedback, but they demonstrated very high interest in the project to the point that about 4 or 5 different departments now want to embark on it. The success of this is practically based on the fact that it was easy to create, easy to expose, and it demonstrated a lot of the potential benefits. What they're planning to do in the course of this year, practically after the Olympics, because until the Olympics, no new initiatives are entertained by the British Network Rail, is to expand it to compliance and ISO accreditation. The next business case actually use a lot of the process books to distribute the knowledge among the users. And this comes from PepsiCo. Now, PepsiCo is a very large organization, but the manufacturing side of PepsiCo, the plants that manufacture the syrups, are distributed in different countries in the world. And each plant operates like its own business unit. And they have to report to a centralized control unit for compliance purposes. So each plant is required to meet internal and external audits every year. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to create the BPM library, the process library, in such a way that it can generate, not only improve the business, but also generate half of the requirements, if not more, for the internal audit and the external audit. In the previous slide, we listed the departments that started on this project. And by the way, the handout, I don't know how many of you downloaded the handout, but they exist on the Infotec site. Those who downloaded it yesterday, there was a wrong version there, but the correct version is there today. So this is Richard Hughes, the director of finance of the Sidra plant, who said, the integration of our internal audit objective within our business operation is a novel approach that has exceeded our highest expectation in terms of effectiveness of our compliance initiative. The GCS, which stands for Global Control System, implementation program has allowed us to promote a culture of governance and process improvement across the organization. And this is the timeline, and they passed the first audit so successfully that now other plants throughout the world are looking at adopting the same type of approach. What they took advantage of is outlining all the responsibilities properly. And do I have time to look at some reports? These are the type of reports that were generated throughout the project. So some of you are familiar with compliance regulatory requirements. Segregation of duties, one of the critical reports, which basically tells which activities you're doing and whether there is any collision between activities. Because you're not the one that can review a transaction, but also execute it, for instance. So these are just some of examples of reports that were generated from the BPM platform. And the way that this is enabled is because you tie the individuals, the roles, the responsibilities at every activity and every level of the process. You can get a great audit trail. This is an example of an SOD report, maybe a little bit bigger. So RASI report. So I'm just going to go quickly here, so we don't. Let me see if I can connect this back. And this is how, and I'm just about to conclude, but I want to show you how a typical user can get into a BPM, the process library, and by context can look at their own processes, their own reports. If they have to execute any process, it's all centralized in one panel. They click on it and they get to their area. So what are the rules for successful, in summary, for successful deployment? Start at the strategy level, create the big picture, which is the process library. Prioritize improvements and automation projects. And make sure that it's not a one-time project. That's what happened in many organizations. It became a one-time project that gathered electronic dust afterwards. In conclusion, BPM can improve your culture, create transparency. Engagement is critical. You engage your stakeholder. If deployed right, it's like going to the gym. It will take your business to a greater shape. It's a multi-level initiative, and you got to choose your focus area and proceed from there. I want to thank you for your attentive listening, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer.